Hi, this is Alina, and you're listening to Your PharmD Bestie. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Your PharmD Bestie. Today, we are going to have a special guest talk about NAPLEX and CPJE studying tips. So today's topic will be introduced by the question of you've graduated pharmacy school. Now what? Today, I'm excited to have a good friend of mine come on to the podcast to talk about preparing for pharmacy board exams. He was the first person I thought about to talk about this topic with because I would trust literally no one other to walk me through how to study appropriately for an exam, whether that was during pharmacy school or even for my own board exams. So I'm introducing David Nguyen. I'll have him introduce himself, where he's from, and where he currently is for residency.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Like Alina said, my name's David. I went to pharmacy school with Alina at UCSF. I'm currently a PGY1 at San Francisco, at Zuckerberg San Francisco General in San Francisco. And I'll be starting a PGY2 in psychiatric pharmacy at LA County Department of Mental Health next year. Super excited to be on her podcast, to be sharing some insights on this topic, because I know how stressful it can be. It's the last obstacle to overcome before you really start your careers after finishing pharmacy school. And for many of you, it's the first step in continuing your long, fruitful careers. So I know it's overwhelming. I want to be here to help break it down to something that's more palpable and to help set you up for success.
Thank you for your introduction, David. So we'll first dive into the NAPLEX specifically. NAPLEX, which stands for North American Pharmacist Licensure Examination, is 225 question multiple choice computerized exam, and you have typically 6 hours to complete it. And generally, the whole purpose of it is to test your competency in pharmacy. The process to apply can be time consuming. So my recommendation is to start the application process as soon as you get your PharmD degree. And you have up to 5 times to pass the NAPLEX, but keep in mind that following the third time, you do have to wait until the following year. So three chances within a year before you can take the exam again. And you also have to wait for the additional reprocessing time to get the authorization to test, which is 45 days from your last exam date. So for someone starting off, David, how do you recommend studying for the NAPLEX?
Yeah, the test is super long, so there's a lot of material to cover. I would definitely recommend someone starting early, maybe 2 or 3 months out of before your anticipated test date, and start really mapping out what your study schedule will look like in advance. For most of us, or for those of you that are planning to go into residency, you basically have about a month and a half, 2 months from the end of graduating pharmacy school to starting residency. So with that schedule, it'll keep you on track, break down the areas in which you need the most help and like front load in the beginning and just keep you on track as you make it through the entire book. There's a lot of different, I guess, exam prep programs that either your pharmacy school offers or that are just available for students to purchase. And I definitely recommend sticking to just one, because if you're bouncing back between multiple different programs, it might be really hard to not only get used to the consistent testing, the ways that they test you, but also be very overwhelmed by how much material that you're going through.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. For UCSF, they had us use RX Prep. I know some of my prior co-residents used past NAPLEX, and I've also had people ask me which one I recommended, but I think if 90% of our class was able to use RX Prep and pass, I think it's pretty solid resource. And as David said, you don't want to overwhelm yourself. So definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience as to what the other programs look like, but from my personal experience, I think the way the RX Prep formulates their test bank questions is pretty true to how NAPLEX ends up being. And I felt like some of the questions from RX Prep seemed harder than the actual NAPLEX. So that's my recommendation, to go with that. But as you're going through the program, there's a lot of different chapters and materials. So definitely go through all the various disease states that they have, complete all the practice problems for each disease state as you go along, and make sure you take notes of all the questions that you get incorrect, because those might be the areas that you're struggling with when it comes to the real exam.
Yeah, for me, I found it helpful to at least keep repeating the incorrect questions that I got, and you can kind of manage what type of questions you want when you formulate or create an exam on RX Prep. So that was really nice. And if you're able to keep repeating the ones you get incorrect until you really get them all correct, then I mean you probably know the material pretty well. So that was kind of how I went through the test bank questions for RX Prep.
Yeah, good advice that I got from a lot of people and sources that I read on Reddit is for each chapter that you're doing, you want to try to aim for at least 70%, at least on RX prep. And in that case, once you hit 70%, you can feel at least competent and sufficient that your knowledge in that area is good. You're not going to get everything right, but for the most part, that means your baseline is high enough to hopefully answer all the questions that you get, or most of the questions that you get. I guess the next thing to talk about is how did you go about organizing what you studied?
I can touch on that a little bit. For that, as you mentioned at the beginning, creating like a study schedule, there are certain chapters or topics that are, I guess you could call them like high yield. So there may be more of the bread and butter, but you know that they're probably going to test you on it. So that could be like anticoagulation, HIV, hypertension, ID, which is, I think, almost like separated into 4 different sub-chapters in the RX prep book. So those are really long chapters, but they're also probably more high yield, but it would also mean that you would wanna spend more time or a lot more time to study for those. So let's say, like, if you were to create a calendar or schedule, for it, maybe a lot, like 4 days to complete the ID chapter, whereas for, a chapter like, let me think, IBS, you could spend, like, maybe half a day studying that. And then once you have your schedule down, again, like, going through it, following that schedule closely to keep you on track and accountable. Am I missing anything? I think that's how I approached it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to start formulating where to start first. I think what's more difficult is where do I go after I've already hit all the high yield stuff? Because you're still left with maybe half the book of material. And so in that case, I'd probably say to start prioritizing chapters and disease states that you might be less familiar with. You didn't learn it too deeply in class, or you just didn't have an appy rotation in them. So it might just have been a while since you learned or read this material. And so using those chapters as maybe the next chunk of material to cover after the high yield ones would make sure that you're more likely to catch gaps in your clinical knowledge and you're covering material that you are less familiar with more early on than punting that towards the end of your studying where you might need a little bit more repetition. So that's how we would go about like formulating like the subject you're going to study. But the thing to know is it's so easy to very much like passively study, just read the book, take in all this information. It's like 1,000 pages, like super hard to even know if it's kind of entering your mind or if you're noting anything in particular. So I would highly recommend trying to be as active as possible when you're studying. Like take notes on the most key important information, take notes on things that you didn't know or forgot. The information, at least in RX prep, that came in the study tip gals or the key drug dissections. Those are the manufacturers know that these are the high yield facts that might come up on the exam. So making note of those and using flashcards, always good for active recall and to come back to review a chapter instead of going through everything again.
Yeah, I highly agree with that, and there's a lot of great already made Quizlet packs that basically highlight a lot of the things that are mentioned in the study tip gal or key drug guys. We could talk about even like some of the well-known acronyms that people use or mnemonics to remember very particular facts about a drug. And that kind of dives into more of what I would say really helped me establish understanding of the material I was learning. A tip that David also taught me when I was studying for my exam. There are definitely going to be a lot of hard concepts, and you might not remember everything once you've gone through the book once, as an example. But once you've gone through the material enough, you should be able to identify the top 3 to 4 most common or most important facts about a specific drug. And these are generally like highlighted in the study tip gals or the key drug guy portions. But to understand this better, like let me give an example. So if a question on the test asks about rifampin, like you should automatically think about, oh, SIP induction. What are the most particular side effects, like discoloration? It's part of the right treatment. And you can look for signs of what the question might be asking for in that context in the patient case that is given to you on the exam. So another example, if a question asks about phenytoin, think about SIP induction again, pull out the mnemonics, and think about what other acronyms phenytoin is part of. And again, there's Quizlets that give you all these acronyms and mnemonics that help you memorize these specific facts about each drug. So go to Quizlet to look for those resources, really good resources.
Yeah, I would say there were so many questions where just from memorizing these mnemonics or acronyms at the back of my hand let me answer like the questions pretty instantaneously. It's like you don't have to do the extra brain work to try to critically think about it because they're just asking you about a fact that the mnemonic covered. I think that definitely saves you a lot of mental capacity as well as time for like the more difficult questions where you might be in between one or two answers and you just gotta sit there and stare at it to give your best educated guess. So having questions that you can, like just breeze through, definitely alleviates some of that stress.
Yeah. And remember it's a 6-hour exam. You don't have to take that entire time, but for me as an example, I was pretty close to reaching that 6 hours because 'cause I'm a slow test taker, but by the time you reach like halfway, you're already mentally tired. And so again, like having those tools, acronyms in the back of your head where you can just immediately say, "Okay, this is the answer," or then again, certain questions where maybe you're at the last 2 and you're like, "Oh, it could be 50-50." You're not really sure. Yeah, I can make an educated guess, but we'll talk about this later, where you may be better to just take the guess and get that question wrong than spend too much time on it and too much mental capacity on it. But yeah, I appreciate that tip.
Yeah. Um, Another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about that relates more to studying the exam and not just studying the material on the exam is thinking about as you go through the practice questions, looking at how the cases are formulated, the type of information that most of them like to include, and looking for trends in either the labs, reported side effects, or just specific patient information that they throw in there to help you really tease out what potential questions and answers that they're looking for. To give an example, when you're going through various cases and you see a pregnant woman of childbearing age, let's say, and I see them put an HCG and it's either positive or negative. And when it's positive, I can tell you that this question is most likely, and say with like 80% certainty, at least one of them is going to be asking about a medication that is either contraindicated in pregnancy or not the most efficacious in pregnancy. And so just knowing that these small markers are leading the question towards a specific direction help me instantaneously like reduce the possible answer choices to either one or at most two without even reading the whole case or question. Like I would literally skip to the question after saying HCG, and I knew that I knew what they were looking for. So just keep in mind that this test has also been around for like so long, and they're testing a very core principle concepts in pharmacy. It is very easy to know or to use that limitation to your advantage and help improve your test taking skills. Again, another way to reduce the mental burden that you have to kind of go through if you start recognizing those patterns in the test questions themselves.
That's a really, really good tip. Um, and something that I don't think a lot of people really mention. So I appreciate how you were able to put that also in a way that's very easy to understand. Um, so a lot of the tips that we just talked about can also be applied to the CPJE, and we'll kind of skip forward to talking about that because I think we've covered a good amount about NAPLEX, unless there's anything that you want to add to that. But we can also,
No, no, just in general, it's like thinking, I want to be here to show you guys not when we can't study for you guys. So it's trying to implement tips and tools for you to be better at taking the test itself as well. So take those things and study as hard as you can. But I think we'll move on to the CPJE and talk a little bit about the differences between the two exams.
yeah. So the CPJE, for those who are out of state and might not know what it is, specific to California, stands for California Practice Standards and Jurisprudence Exam. It's a 90 question multiple choice exam. You have 2 hours to complete it. A common mistake I can say right off the top of my head is that people commonly think that this is a law exam, but it's actually more like 75% clinical and 25% law. Questions are generally shorter, more straightforward, but can also feel more rapid fire and very random. So before we dive too much into that, I guess same question again, David. How would you recommend someone study for the CPJE?
Yeah, like Alina said, don't be fooled that it's called the like practice standards and jurisprudence exam. I would say this exam is mostly a random clinical exam that will test your knowledge of like dosing, brand names, and whether or not a prescription looks right more than it will test you for specific like law exam question. And people are really thrown off by it because they focus so much on like the law portion of when they are studying that they often neglect the more difficult sections, which is clinical. At a certain point, I kind of wish they gave me more law questions because those at least you could predict, if you have a good studying background on them, those are like kind of easy in the sense that like it's more contained in the area that they can be asking you, so you're not thrown off guard. In terms of studying for the CPJE, I would say schedule your CPJE after your NAPLEX because in studying for NAPLEX, for the most part, you're doing a lot of the clinical reviewing that you would need for the CPJE. Um, for the law portion of the CPJE, that's where you would use like either a supplementary material, such as like we used at UCSF, the RX Prep CPJE, like course and guide that was very similar to the NAPLEX um, studying program. Or I believe you can also buy like a booklet that they have specifically from, I think it's like Board of
I
Pharmacy.
think so. There's also, I guess, depending on like what connections you have, but there's like a secret guide to, is that what you're talking about? The secret guide to like,
No, that's different. It's called CPJE Secrets. And that documentation or that booklet is also really good to PDF. It's really good because it does do the same thing in the way that RX Prep does, where it breaks down every single disease state and like the key facts that you have. That might be an extra cost depending on like where and who you buy it from. But I felt like a lot of the information was redundant after your research on Netflix, but also another resource that you can look at.
yeah, generally Board of Pharmacy like already gives certain resources and like practice questions, right? There's definitely a few practice exams for just the law portion specifically. So head to their website to look for um, extra practice or just guidance on where to start for that.
Oh, for sure. Okay. Yeah, I also think that a program like using for me using RX Prep and going through all their test bank questions, I felt like they were really good about asking specific scenarios to the point, even though it felt like redundant, it felt like any of the law questions that came up, be able to answer much more confidently and feel less shocked by. So again, having a resource that has a test bank questions, um, will stimulate kind of like the testing environment, the type of questions that they have. And those are like tried and true practice programs that, you know, have worked for so many people. So would probably go with the highest common denominator in that sense of just trusting that finishing those programs for the most part is sufficient in helping you get through the law stuff.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And then something that's specific to CPJE as well. Unlike the NAPLEX, which you might see some brand name drugs, the CPJE is entirely brand name drugs. So as supplementary review, like know the brand names of, for example, like the top 300 drugs, top 500 if you have time, because again, it's very brand name specific. You could get like a really extremely random drug and be asked what the appropriate like dosage should be for that. And if you don't know what drug they're talking about, then you can't answer the question. So definitely that's like a very high yield tip. Know the brand names.
Yeah, that's probably something you wouldn't do for the NAPLEX. So when transitioning for the NAPLEX, from the NAPLEX to CBJ studying, or even throughout your NAPLEX studying, I would sprinkle in some maybe daily or weekly practice of brand names. Because I know at least at UCSF, we didn't focus too much on brand names. So there was a lot that was missing. And that's part of, I guess, the test taking strategy to build here, right? It's like you're not memorizing these brand names and all the mechanisms and everything that come across or that are related to it to get the answer right. You're memorizing these brand names to even give you a shot of answering the question. So if your test taking skills and you're studying from the NAPLEX is sufficient, even giving yourself a chance to make a better educated guess goes a long way, especially when it's 200 questions on the CPJE. And historically, a lot of people um, have a more difficult time passing the CPJE than the NAPLEX.
Any other specific tips that you have for the CPJE?
Yeah, I guess because it is a law exam, there are a lot of different, let's say, like situations that will impact your answer, like very, very detail oriented, like how long does an electronic prescription last or have to be stored versus how long does a paper prescription have to be stored. And so having those specific scenarios and numbers like written out as like on a cheat sheet for yourself to just like constantly repeat, I think would be something that is high yield to get all of those law questions correctly, as well as knowing the brand and generic and scheduling of controlled substances, because a lot of these laws do pertain against like um, how we can dispense them, how do we store their prescription, how do we order them, and so knowing which drug goes into which category, I think, is a high yield thing to know.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really good tip. Between the CPJE and NAPLEX, this might be a silly question. Did you have a preference for one or the other?
For the test,
Yeah.
I like the Naplex because I feel like one, it covers just like more material generally, and it feels like it tests you. It feels good to kind of like be able to answer so many like different questions and have a fair shot at answering them because it's case based and it tests more of your clinical knowledge. Um, and I also like the fact that if you studied correctly and kind of implement some of the tips that we recommended earlier, it feels like you can just like cheat the test in the way that's like, okay, like I know what you're trying to do. I'm smarter than that. I've prepared for that. And on top of that, I know I have the clinical knowledge to get the question right. Versus at the CPJE, sometimes the questions are literally so random. Like there's a brand name. I have no idea what it is. I'm literally just guessing. And that doesn't feel fair in the sense that it's like testing your clinical knowledge. It's like, yeah, you test the fact if I knew this drug or not, like just based off of recognition. And um that was okay. It was shorter though, so, can't complain about that.
Yeah, I did like that it was shorter, but it definitely felt like Russian roulette. And I think it felt bad too because a lot of people coming in from out of state, like we already struggle with the exam in state, but people out of state, like so many people I knew came in, took the exam, were like, why was it like 75% clinical? I studied entirely law. And I was like, yeah. But if you prepare for it, you have definitely a much higher chance of passing. Like, the stress of the CPJE and NAPLEX too, leads me to another topic I wanted to briefly touch on, which is how to handle test anxiety and stress. At least, like, I know that I definitely had a couple, like, anxiety attacks here and there, even when I was taking exams. But for you, David, like, how did you handle the stress when you were studying for these exams or even, like, taking it?
Yeah, I mean, giving this advice and looking back, it can seem like I was so prepared to take this exam, or it was, like, so easy to study for it. But in reality, I think hearing from like our upperclassmen about how difficult they've been having in terms of passing their boards, historically, our school's test rate is like trickling down or like stagnating, and maybe in reality is much more difficult to study. Kind of puts a lot of pressure on you, especially going to residency and knowing if I don't pass, I have only a couple of times, like a couple of more times to retake the test, or I have to juggle retesting while on top of residency. Um, and on one hand, I think the stress kind of gave me a little motivation to take studying like more seriously and try to whip myself into shape. But on the other hand, it's like when you're in the middle of the exam and you don't know an answer to a question and you're like, is this the question that's going to break me? Like, how many more of these do I have before it's not a pass? Can be really stressful. But I think those stresses are two different types of stress. I think we can focus more on like this test or the studying for the test and what that looks like. I think it's really important to be taking, you know, you just graduated pharmacy school. You just grinded for 3, maybe 4 years, and this is probably the first time that you have an extended break before whatever your next future calls for. So I think even though you should be really regimented and strict with a schedule that gives you the highest chance of passing, I think you need to be realistic and need to look back and understand where you are. You need to take a break in between your study sessions. Enjoy some time off because it's been so long since you were able to maybe go on a trip, see your family, see your friends, or just not be bogged down by having to do schoolwork every single day. So I would say implement at least like either an hour or 2 hours every day to just relax, or you can put all that into one rest day during the week if you are more in the mindset of just like grinding all day. But take it slow, be consistent, but like be okay on yourself. Like you went through a little hard time, and most of the information you need for the test is already in your head. Just remember that when you first start studying.
Yeah, I definitely agree and appreciate that sentiment. I think to add on to that, like there are definitely certain, again, like relying on the resources that you have to help you get through the exam. Like know that so many people have passed before, so you the chances of you passing are also high. Like people who've used RX Prep, who've used past NAPLEX, like chances are you use that, you know how to study well, you know what to focus on, like you'll pass. Quizlet for spaced repetition. This is more focused on like how to study for the exam to reduce like the stress level of feeling like you're not prepared for it. Um, if you have trouble with focusing, like Flora, or I've been using it's an app called Opal for locking my apps because I have a huge issue with, like, just picking up my phone and unlocking it. Planners again for, like, staying consistent with your schedule, but at the end of the day, again, remembering to give yourself that break because you should always prioritize your own health before anything else, and if your brain is already, like, filled capacity, anything that you read in that moment, it's not gonna stick, it's not gonna go through, so yeah.
I agree. And like in order to, you know, relieve yourself of some of the stress that does come with like preparing for this like large exam, you should really get like your systems in place, right? Making things as like seamless to study as possible. So it's like it's that schedule, it's knowing what resources you're going to use, it's knowing when you finish reviewing a chapter where your notes are going to be, just like staying as organized as possible and trying to recognize the type of like questions or disease states that are more difficult for you. So you can come back to them later and realize like, hey, this is not the only time I'm going to be reviewing it. If I don't have it right now, I'll go back to it 2 or 3 times, and by the time you get to the exam, like it's not like something you feel unconfident about. And transitioning to like from studying to before the test date, trying to simulate that test environment, right? With RX prep, you can make a lot of practice exams that you can basically be sitting there for 6 hours to just like take practice exams, move through the test, get used to the motions, the type of questions that they're asking. Um, and and you can even practice with different like test taking strategies, right? Like, how quickly do I stare at this question before I move on? Do I try to just guess and then see if guessing in that save me more time later? And just practicing as often as you can what the testing environment looks like makes it a little bit less anxiety inducing when you're there. But once you get to that test and maybe your brain shuts off a little bit from the like anxiety or whatever else you might be feeling in the moment, the repetition, the muscle memory, the habits that you built while you were studying, those are the things that'll get you through the exam. And then, hopefully get you what you need to do.
Mhm. Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, like, once you are in the exam, like, again, you will get some questions wrong or have to take, like, a 50-50 lucky guess, and that's okay, this is a minimum competency exam. You don't have to get every question right to pass. So just keep that in mind. And then with the CPJE specifically, I think they have like 10 or 15 questions in that exam that are considered practice questions. So they're testing out whether it's an appropriate question to include in the exam, possibly in the future, but it doesn't go towards your final score. So if you don't know something, like tell yourself, like maybe it is a practice question and just keep going. That's like all you can really do sometimes. Um, and yeah, any final tips?
Now, in terms of those random like testing questions that they have, you can kind of tell some of the questions are really like weird or just formatted in a different way that you maybe didn't see when you're doing your own like studying. Um, but it's okay to be a little delulu sometimes and say, hey, that question I just did, that was a practice. Anything you need to do to keep your confidence up for the 200 questions, I think is really important to try to do.
Yeah. And honestly, like, again, this is why I invited David because, like, he mentioned that, and I'm like, I don't think I noticed anything off about any of the questions when I was taking CPJE. Like, I was just so focused on getting through it, but David's really good at, like, analyzing the exam, and so I think if you're able to develop skills like that, like, it's so great. Um
Yeah, it's just I think it comes from really paying attention to what the questions look like when I was doing the practice questions, right? Just recognizing trends because the more trends that you can recognize, the less your brain has to work. You can eliminate like whole answers. And I think that's why I kind of like standardized tests because I like to see where they try to trick you with how they format it or the type of questions they ask. and maybe make it into a little game for yourself like I do in terms of like, yeah, you try to get me here, you're not gonna get it. I got it right. Um, so adds a little bit of flavor to this grilling exam that you're taking.
Yeah, all good. We are at the end of the episode. So again, I hope you found this episode really, really insightful and helpful. I really appreciate David for taking some time out to give his advice and just be a great resource for everyone. Again, for future episodes, I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. I've already received some through social media, but keep sending those in so I can address those during the podcast or help you out separately. And I look forward to continuing to provide good episodes to you all. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, again, subscribe, leave some reviews, follow us on social media. Thank you, everyone.